Hi, I'm Barbara Rimkunis, and this is your Exeter History Minute. Are you tired of the news? Wishing perhaps we lived in a sleepier time when people had to actually read the news? Sorry, but that ship has sailed. In all fairness, it's always been hard to avoid the news, especially political news. The big difference now is that we can get it immediately. Although if you watch Congress live on C-SPAN, most of us still need journalists to help make sense of it all. In the first half of the 20th century, Exeter, really all of New England, was lucky enough to have the services of a remarkable Washington correspondent, Mira Webster Richards, keeping an eye on all the political news. Born in Manchester, New Hampshire in 1856, her New England lineage traced back to the 1600s. She married George Richards in 1886 when she was 30 and he was 39. He'd been a railroad agent and later worked as a circulation manager for a newspaper. By the time he and Mira moved to Exeter shortly after their marriage, he was the Washington correspondent for the local paper, the Exeter Newsletter, and the Boston Herald and Manchester Union. In 1898, he was elected as Register of Probate for Rockingham County, and he left journalism. At his side was Mira. They had no children, so with little else to do, she helped George in the probate office. He became ill a few years into his term, and she pretty much took over the job, necessitating the creation of a new position, Deputy Register of Probate, to allow her to legally do the work. George never fully recovered, and in 1909, at the age of 53, Mira Richards found herself a widow with nothing to do. At the suggestion of New Hampshire Senator William Chandler, a family friend, she decided to head to Washington to serve as a special correspondent. There she applied for a press pass and was for some 10 years the only woman admitted to the Senate Press Gallery, which at the time was limited to only accredited political writers for daily newspapers, and apparently men. She also wrote for the many illustrated magazines popular at the time and was known throughout New England as a popular speaker at political and women's clubs. Anytime she wasn't in Washington, Richards would return to Exeter. Now, politically, it's hard to figure out where Mira Richards stood. This was a time when newspapers and their writers didn't try to hide their affiliations. Her husband had been active in the Republican Party in Exeter, and I know husbands and wives don't always agree on these matters, but this was a very Republican town. When the debate heated up in Washington about women's suffrage, she took a job writing for the National Association opposed to women's suffrage. Seriously, Mira? Maybe it was just a job. When the amendment passed, she was on hand for the signing and commented, "Congress heaved a mighty sigh of relief the day the suffrage amendment was wiped off the slate. Even the men who most bitterly opposed it were glad to be rid of the constant heckling of the militant women who are now jubilant." And yet, before Election Day, she was in Exeter, providing women with advice on voting. I think this is where even the best journalist might insert that shrug emoji. It was possible to read her work, at least her newspaper work, without ever knowing she was a woman. It was common for writers to use a pseudonym. For the Exeter Newsletter, she used the pen name John Morgan, eventually shortening it to Morgan. In other publications, she would simply use Richards. In 1930, when she'd been writing for 20 years, the Worcester Sunday Telegram wrote a quick piece describing her as the woman who carries on her husband's work under his familiar name so faithfully. Remember, her husband stopped writing in 1898, 30 years before that. But maybe that's how she found it acceptable to be a working woman in an era when society didn't expect women of a certain social standing to be employed. She said of herself that she was a real homebody, but got no credit for it because she was so constantly in professional life. I'm fond of Washington, but New Hampshire is home to me, and as a place of residence, Washington doesn't hold a candle to Exeter. When she wasn't writing under a pen name, she used her widow's name, Mrs. George Richards. Even her obituary doesn't list her first name. I had to track down her marriage license to find out she was named Mira. She died in 1934, having covered Washington politics through Prohibition, the First World War, women's suffrage, President Wilson's health crisis, the sudden death of Warren Harding, and the onset of the Great Depression. She was hopeful when she covered Franklin Roosevelt's inauguration in 1933, the 6th inaugural she'd covered. She pinned on her press pass, writing, "Oh yes, you may feel as if you are wearing a smallpox warning or the flag of an auction and try to hide that tag under your coat when it is not in use. But it is a lifesaver and precious above rubies till taps are sounded hours later." Admit it, Mrs. George Richards. Myra, you loved every minute. This History Minute has been sponsored by Anne Swain Citizens Bank Mortgage Center. Check our website, www.exeterhistory.org, for more information. Signing off as Mrs. Michael Nickerson.